Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Allen, and I'm joined by my podcast partner, Bob Duff, on the hockeydebates.com podcast. We come to you twice a week to talk all things hockey, even when there's not hockey being played, as it is not right now. And our special guest is Frank Brown, who was the recipient of the Elmer Ferguson Award bestowed upon him by the Hockey Hall of Fame last fall, which puts him in pretty elite company. Frank, welcome to our show. And I have a special reason for wanting you on the show, and that is, and this is, I'm being giving full disclosure here. Frank and I are going to do our own podcast starting after when the season starts, and it's going to have an interesting twist to it. We're going to interview Hall of Famers, and I don't know how often we're going to do it, but we're going to interview people who have been elected to the Hall of Fame, and it should be a lot of fun. And couldn't think of anyone else better to do it with than Frank Brown, who not only worked for the league as the vice president, was it of public relations, media relations? What was your title, Frank?
Media relations, and then later communications.
Okay, communications. All right. But also, and I think a lot of people have forgotten this, Frank was a long-time NHL scribe. Like I've done a lot of historical books, and when I go back into the 1970s and start researching themes, I find Frank Brown Associated Press stories that I glean a lot of information from. He goes way back. He was there in Lake Placid when the Miracle on Ice occurred, so he's got a lot of history into this game. And let's start right there, Frank. And one of the other reasons why I wanted to have you on is that you work so closely with Gary Bettman. And obviously I know him from covering him, but you know him in a different way. And I've been saying on podcasts that, we may not all agree with how the league rolls there. He was one of the most buttoned-up executives I've ever met. He does nothing without giving it considerable thought and analysis. And can you just give us sort of a general idea of how Gary Bettman approaches all issues?
The one thing I would say for starters is thoroughness and just a complete focus on making sure that he has all of the information that is available, so that when you're in a position such as his, you have to get the first guess right, because the second guessers are a multitude. And so you have to work your way through all possible eventualities. More important, or at least as important, what are the unintended consequences that you need to consider. You need to consider what you're going to have a direct impact on, but you also have to consider what consequences may eventuate from those decisions that you make. And one as dramatic as having the league return to play, no matter how many venues they use, whether they have fans or they don't, every domino knocks over another one in the thought process. So I'm certain that he's researching this thoroughly, asking for input and insight from the medical community, from the other sports leagues, his colleagues, who are running the other sports leagues, and every other possible conventional and non-conventional input.
One thing that's always impressed me, one aspect of the Gary Bettman regime, is there's no loose cannons. There's no I don't ever recall an owner going rogue and publicly disagreeing with the league's stance on anything. There's no Harold Ballards. There's no Charlie Finleys. And when you're talking about 31 teams, that's pretty impressive to keep all 31 of the horses in the barn without any of them getting out.
One thing I would point out, Bob, is that at this stage of things, really, all but a very, very, very few of the owners and governors in the league preceded Gary's tenure. Now that he is the senior commissioner among the 4 major sports leagues, you have to bear in mind that other than Jeremy Jacobs and a very, very small number of others, Gary played a significant part in bringing the current a dominant portion of the current board into the league. So they are, he and current governors are, very much, they very much understand each other, and because really so many of them have never known any other commissioner than he.
Frank, up until the pandemic, I would have said, there's nothing you haven't seen in the NHL. But what you haven't seen is NHL games played without any fans in the stands. And that's likely to happen. Just paying homage to the virus that we're going to have to do that. Give me your thoughts on what we can expect with no fans in the stands. And will players even notice as focused as they are in a big game?
It's whose dog? It's difficult to predict, Kevin. The interesting thing I think from the goalies, the standpoint of the goalies, it might actually be easier for them to follow the puck when it gets above the boards because they're used to seeing people usually in dark clothing, and the puck blends into them. So it'll be interesting to see. If it actually helps the goalies a little bit, but it's the great unknown, and it would be strange of me to forecast what the players might be thinking. I will say that it will be different, and I say that simply because so many of the players, when they play outdoor games for the first time, have such an odd reaction to hearing the cheers, or the boos or the oohs, several seconds after the play that would have elicited them. So hearing silence is something that I imagine that they'll adjust to, but it's going to be an adjustment for all of us as spectators as well.
You mentioned goaltending, Frank. We should point out that Kevin is the only member of our panel who is not a goaltender. I kind of
proud of it.
And I kind of feel left out because I'm the only member of the panel who's not a Hall of Famer. So I feel like Wayne and Garth, I'm not worthy to be here. But anyway, we'll go on, and I'll do my best to keep up with my worthy compatriots here. One of the things I've wondered about with this whole aspect, it's not really the sports that are going to make the call. I mean, they can want to play all they want, but ultimately, isn't it still in the politicians' hands? If a governor of a state says you can't play sports here, then the teams really can't do anything about it.
Yeah, and I think it's one of the things that will go into the first guess scenario that I mentioned earlier, Bob. I think among the constituent groups from whom Gary will absolutely elicit guidance is the government agencies that will be that ultimately will have a dominant voice in whether sports return or not.
Frank, I just want to get your thoughts too. You were intimately involved in, at least on the inside of the collective bargaining agreement negotiations. And it just seems to me that regardless of what we do here, there's going to be a disruption in the force caused by this pandemic. Obviously, the revenue is going to be down. You're going to have to make some adjustments with the salary cap. Obviously, contracts expire July 1. Can you just sort of explain how disruptive? I mean, those are all things that can be fixed with negotiations, but can you just sort of explain for our viewers just how disruptive this is really going to be for just the logistics of the game?
Yeah, it will be. The one thing I will say that is actually a positive to all this, Kevin, is that over the years, there has really developed a I won't say cordial, but I will say collaborative approach between the league and the players relative to collective bargaining issues. The overt hostility that we all remember entirely too well and entirely too painfully really has been approached by a much more businesslike understanding of each point of view from each side. Accordingly, the issues are, of course, they are bones of contentions, but they're not grounds for battle. Okay, and so every one of these details, both from the ownership side and from the players' side, will be approached on a much more businesslike and collaborative basis, I would say. That being said, there are things that the players will think of that the owners might not have, and vice versa. Similarly, there will be any number of, I think, agreements that have to be reached relative to just saying, okay, we understand it's an issue. We're not going to let it disrupt or keep us from playing. We'll continue to work on it as long as we have a certain framework in place that agrees to approach these things as rapidly as possible while the plane is in the air, so to speak.
One issue that hasn't really been talked about much, and I'll be honest, I don't know a significant amount about it, but certainly there's immigration issues with the professional athletes. I mean, probably more so with baseball and hockey than the other major sports, but I'm sure players have gone home to Europe, players have gone home to Canada that played in the U.S. Now, I remember this year when the Wings traded for Dmytro Timashov, it took a good 2 weeks for his green card to come forth and his immigration stuff to allow him to enter the U.S. and play for the Red Wings. So I wonder, how do those things work? Are they renewed annually? Is there an issue if this season goes into July and August? And as a point of fact, right now, the Canada-U.S. border is closed, so how would players get across the border unless politicians deem sports to be an essential service?
Well, Bob, what you've just done is in a matter of a few seconds outlined something that I'm sure there are entire armies of attorneys and immigration experts really pursuing exactly that. But if you imagine that as one strand in a giant bowl of spaghetti, every one of these issues, and this is another thing that I was referring to earlier relative to the unintended consequences. Well, okay, what if we can get players from a certain area in, but not another area in, or what the work visa situation may be, whether what do we do about the officials? What do we do about camera people? Okay, what do the broadcasters do about how they're going to staff the games wherever the games are going to be played? Are the broadcasters themselves going to be on site or off site? You may see Hockey Night in Canada announcers strictly from a studio. So there are so many dominoes and there are so many concentric circles in terms of what the major hockey broadcasters are going through on their end, okay, in terms of the crossing the border and so forth. Okay, there may be any number of TSN broadcasters who may not be able to do games in the United States for exactly the reason that you mentioned.
One final question, Frank, before we let you go. There's been a lot of discussion about whether we should move the draft up, particularly after the success that the NFL had and the excitement level. I mean, we're all sort of starving for any form of sports. And I got into a huge debate on another podcast with Tom Laidlaw, who said we should just change the draft to the start of June just because of the public relations value, that we need this and we need to just kind of celebrate the NHL before we even get back in the season. And I argued that I didn't want to see it simply because I don't like changing the rules in midstream. Like, everyone is operating, fan bases are now expecting, a certain format for how the lottery is going to work. And we're hearing that if we do that, we might have to go back to the old rules. And, to me, that just seems like it's just not fair. I like to stick with the rules we have. As a fan of the game, and not as a former NHL employee, what do you think about moving the draft to June?
I always really encourage, and this is a function of age and experience, Kevin, staying with the program as much as possible. In other words, you have to play long ball here. You have to look at the long-term picture over the short-term reality that we're all dying for any fresh hockey content that we can enjoy. We know that, but you have to take a longer view. And I think that the governors, the managers will be resistant, honestly, to changing the schedule unless it is absolutely the last resort. And the reason being, it's I guess you say, okay, well, then we know what our draft order is, but how do you pick, how do you determine, do you use the draft order from last year, going forward? Because you know that the Stanley Cup champion is assigned the last pick in the first round. Okay, so how do you do that when you haven't, when you may not have reached an outcome to the playoff?
Yeah.
So then, you have an anomaly, okay, and then you're going to return the following year, presumably, to the format that has worked before. Okay, yeah. The issue is with a regular season that hasn't been concluded yet, and we've all seen it enough times to know that a team can get hot late, can get into the playoffs on the last day. Okay, but if we go based on what the standings are now, let's say if we have to create a draft order, then you're foreclosing against the possibility team that's not in the playoffs right now could end up in the playoffs if we gave them the opportunity to play the games. And this is why nobody is sleeping. None of these executives are sleeping, okay, because they're all thinking of the what ifs, because that's 90% of executive, of what an executive does.
Yeah. No, it goes like they say, they don't pay me because I'm good. They pay me to make the tough decisions. So I don't envy the folks that have to make these decisions, because there's people like me and you and Bob and a billion fans that'll be second guessing them after they do make them. So anyway, Frank, it's a pleasure to have you on. We appreciate it. And hopefully we can have you on when we're talking about real hockey in probably a couple of months.
It was a treat to talk about not real hockey right now, so I look forward to coming back again if you'll have me. Thank you.
Yes, we will. Thank you. Okay, that's been Frank Brown, former NHL vice president of communications, and also a former hockey scribe who covered the NHL and the New York Rangers in particular for the New York Daily News, and before that, the Associated Press. And Bob, that last question, I'm still sort of troubled by that. I'm not sure it's going to happen, but, they want to move it up, and I understand why. I followed the NFL draft gavel to gavel, and as I admitted, I was starved for sports. It was fun to see the bios and all the players, and it's not hard to sort of fan your interest for the NFL draft, because you have a lot of colleges that you're familiar with. And even if you don't know the players, there's certain things that are sort of built into your football fandom. You kind of know that players that come out of the SEC, historically do well in the NFL, and, which schools sort of produce linemen and so forth. And if they tell you that a guy can run a 4.3 40, well, you can raise your eyebrows and go, whoa, okay, that man can motor. So there's a lot sort of built in. Plus, I'm not so sure we would get quite the buzz south of the Canadian border that I think people think we will. You can tell stories about these players, but I'm not sure that it will resonate as well with the American audience. I think there were a lot of casual fans among the 51 million who watched the NFL draft, and I don't think we'll get any casual fans if we do the NHL draft at the start of June.
No, and like Frank said, the season's not over. The NFL season was over.
Right.
Having the draft wasn't out of the norm. And they even some people thought they shouldn't have had their draft because it's just, not important. But in scope of the world, things that are going on right now. But I don't know. I don't see why they should change the way they could do things. If they could do it without endangering anyone, which they did, I don't see why it was a problem to have the draft. And I'm sure, like you say, it was nice for people to have something to talk about rather than talking about COVID-19.
Yeah, that's for sure. There was some sort of, I don't know if we want to call it news, but, John Scott, a former All-Star MVP, tweeted out that he had been told by some folks to expect NHL training camps to start June 1st. And that sort of fits into the time frame that we had sort of been hearing. And there's been more openness now about the, going to the NHL sites where, they have multiple ranks and aren't officially listed as a COVID-19 hotspot. So there's been a lot of discussion about where we're going to play, and it seems pretty clear we're going to play. We're going to attempt to play, and we got a little bigger piece of news too that I'll get to in a minute. But it seems like we're now, even though I don't think they're fully committed to everything because we don't know what the landscape will look like, even 2 weeks from now or 3 weeks from now, because we're starting to have, states opening up, and if it starts to flare up again, then all bets could be off. But one thing that came out that I think is worth discussing is that Bill Daley was quoted as saying, Bill Daley being the deputy commissioner, that just because we have a single positive test from a player or even multiple tests, that it doesn't necessarily mean that we would have to shut down the season again. Now, I think at first blush, you're going, what? But I think the way he explained it, I understood the logic. What he said is, we need the context of that. And he just said, we're going to look at each case individually. I think they're going to try to determine quickly, how this, sort of trace the contacts before, and then sort of monitor it. And if it was, like 3 on one team, and then they remove them and quarantine them, and then they retest them for the next couple of days, then they would just kind of proceed on. I think they're going to look at it on a case-by-case basis, as opposed to some hard and fast rule that says, okay, multiple tests, and we raise our hands and fold our tents and go home.
Well, are they even going to tell us? I mean, they don't tell us about any other injury. Are they just going to say the guy's got an upper body injury and he's out for 14 days?
Yeah. Exactly, for 14 days. Well, if he tests positive for the virus, it might be longer than 14 days. Because you never quite know, how it's going to affect each individual person. Now, one of the things that I think doesn't come up enough too is like, and you wonder if this is even discussed. And it would be difficult not to discuss it. But, if you're young and healthy like an athlete, the chances of this disease being fatal are minute, unless you've got probably an underlying medical condition you're not aware of. That doesn't mean you're not going to get very sick. And we've seen cases of people who have gotten very, very sick, who are, not in the at-risk, group. And I wonder if that sort of comes into it. Do they, think in those terms? But, that's what you also have to factor is, that this is it's not only players that will have inside this safe zone bubble and trying to play, but, I'm assuming there'll be, older coaches. Joel Quenneville's, an older coach. Will have 70-year-old David Poyle, I'm assuming with leading as Nashville Predators. We're going to have Lou Lamoriello, who's in his 70s. I believe Jim Rutherford is in his 70s. We have a lot of older. Ken Holland is 64 or 65, somewhere in that range, which is in the zone as well. So I mean, there's it's not just all the players that we have to think about. We got to think about everything, and I'm sure they will. But I don't know, what's your level of concern on a 1 to 10 about whether this is the right thing to do, Bob?
Well, now, as big a sports fan as I am, I just can't wrap my head around it being a big priority right now. It was interesting today, Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, and then for any American listeners out there who don't know their Canadian government, the Premier is the equivalent of the governor in your country. He came out today with a 3-stage plan of basically reopening the province. Now, there was no specific timeline. It was just, this is how the order it's going to go when they decide to do it. And part of the final stage, the third stage, the absolute last part, he emphasized this, was that any kind of large gatherings, sporting events, concerts, they're not even on the radar right now. They're not even talking about that. That's the very last thing they're going to look at. So you get the biggest province in Canada. That would be like the governor of New York or the governor of California saying the same thing. So you get the biggest province in Canada saying, yeah, sports isn't even on our radar. So when you've got, the highest level of government saying that, you got to wonder, how do these sports organizations get around that? Because ultimately it's the politicians who are going to make the call and the public health officials on whether they let this happen.
Yeah, I mean, I would be, like if they announced that we're going to resume the season on, July 16th, I'd be making plans to be on my couch watching, and I would so look forward to it. But my level of concern is high. I'm in the red zone. I'm just concerned about it, and I'm having a difficult time sort of reconciling, my fan side and my journalistic side. My fan side says, "Oh, bring it on. Let's play. We need this." America needs entertainment. Everybody's working hard to try to mitigate the damage of this virus. We're all sequestered. We're all making sure that we're isolated, trying to do our best. And, we kind of deserve sports, even if it's sports without people in the stands. And then my journalistic side says, man, I don't know, this just seems wrong that we're rushing this. And, are we going to cause more harm than good? It's kind of the old medical do no harm. That's the number one, the mandate of all physicians, do no harm. Well, are we doing no harm by playing here? So I struggle with it, and I don't have an answer. And I was being sincere when I said to Brown is, boy, I wouldn't want to make this decision. This is a difficult decision. Like, it's complicated because there's a whole lot of people who are dependent upon the economics of sports. Like, if it comes back, suddenly we have, probably more jersey sales. The hockey card industry would benefit having them, back. There's probably numerous industries that I'm not thinking of that sort of piggyback off sort of the sports industry. So, there's the economic issue, and then there's the safety issue as well. And just think of all the people that have to be involved to put on even games, like the off-ice officials, the people who, the Zamboni driver, people who work within the arena. And are they all going to go in this bubble, this safe zone that they're going to sort of create to try to keep the virus away? So a lot of serious questions about this, but it sure appears like we're going to play, or we're going to give it a go, I guess is the best way to describe it.
Well, I don't dispute that they should be making plans to have the possibility to go, but I just don't think realistically we're there yet where you can start thinking, yeah, this is going to happen. I think it's still a pipe dream. I understand, the thinking of athletes. I've worked around athletes my whole life. They're positive people. Like when we had Brad Smith on a couple of weeks ago, he said he always is a glass half full kind of guy, and I think that's pretty standard in the sporting industry in any sport, because they're optimistic people. They see hope. They always see the outcome going in their favor. And I can understand from that point of view, yeah, you got to get ready in case it does happen. But I just don't think it's a realistic possibility right now. I just think there's too many roadblocks that are going to keep it from happening.
Yeah. Well, they talk about it's interesting to me that we hear more about the NHL restarting than the NBA. The NBA, we heard yesterday that they're going to allow open up their workout facilities, but it's just for people to work on individually. And as far as I can tell now, there's probably more, and I haven't just heard of them, but there's only one in Atlanta. Was the only place where I heard that they were, they were going to open. So I don't know, what does that mean? If the NBA is not, I'm sure that the NBA has plans. Don't get me wrong, but we've heard about possibly Vegas and so forth, but you just don't hear about it as much as we've heard about what's going on with the NHL. So I don't know. I'm just kind of worried about it all, and maybe we're worrying for no good reason. That and when push comes to shove, if they look at it and they think it's too much, they won't do it. But we're pushing forward with the idea that we're going to play. There's no doubt about it.
It seems to all be coming from your side of the border too. You don't hear Canadian politicians or Canadian public health officials or anybody on this side of the border really talking about bringing back sports. Donald Trump had a whole bunch of sports commissioners meet with him a couple of weeks ago. There's been nothing like that in Canada. There's been no kind of summits or discussions about what do you think we can do, when do you think we can go forward. So it does seem to be an American-driven initiative right now.
Yeah, well, that sounds about right. Right now we do seem a little crazed in a lot of different respects. So anyway, you have been listening to the hockeydebates.com podcast. We'll be back on Thursday with another guest, and we'll talk some more hockey. Hopefully we can find something that isn't always pandemic related here. It seems like we've been talking so much about not playing hockey. It'd be nice to talk about something fun in the sport. Maybe we can find a couple of topics for Thursday. Anyway, thanks for joining us, and hope to see you again on Thursday.
Thanks a lot, people. We'll see you on Thursday.